Video, Unit 5A, Before the Civil War Review. This is the first in Unit 5, which is actually our first unit for high school. The other units were for earlier time periods that you would have had in middle school, or if you were in AP, you had it. For each video, I'll have the standards that will be covered. This one is 2.1, Review the Causes and Consequences of the Civil War. That's very broad. This is a review over things that you would have had in middle school. The state of Florida would have had more in-depth standards for you in middle school. Going back to the first week of school, where we covered the bracketing dates. For this one, 1848, the end of the Mexican-American War. This is the time period we're really going to be focusing in on, and what happens after that. The discovery of gold in 1848, the 1849ers, the 49ers that came to California in a gold rush. This will spur on a lot of the things that happened, like the Compromise of 1850. We will end with 1860 when Lincoln is elected. The Confederate States of America is born. Now, this time period is usually called Antebellum. It's not just the 1850s, but that's the time period that we're concentrating on. The main theme during this time period is sectionalism. Usually you think of the North and the South, and then we think of the West. And this map here is not exactly correct, because at this time period, most of this land was not inhabited by the United States. Native Americans still were the main people occupying it. The North, though, would be what used to be connected to what was the West. And this is where, over time, we will have, with canals, railroads, roads, that area will be connected, and the South's going to be, throughout the early 1800s, more and more isolated. Immigration was big in the 1830s, 1840s, and continue in the 1850s. The Irish potato famine was the largest. We also had large numbers coming from Germany and other areas, but Ireland and Germany were two of the main areas. But most of these immigrants were going to the area of the North, and so the population was growing there. Meanwhile, transportation, the North, where I said, was being interconnected, the North and the West, where there were railroads that were connecting these together. They were roads before that time period, going back to the American system of Henry Clay and the Whigs. The South, meanwhile, did not need to build large railroads, because they naturally have a lot of rivers that are flowing through. If you look at a map of most every state in the South, you will see there are rivers. So there was no reason to spend large amount of money to build a large railroad when you could have a small spur to connect to the river. And so the South used these natural rivers with steamboats as the major source for their transportation. Before we get to the Mexican War, the United States had grown greatly. During the Revolutionary War, we had started out as 13 colonies, but at the end, Britain had given the United States, the young United States, all the area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. Now, they didn't do it just out of kindness. They did it because France was fighting on our side. They did not want to give it to France. They figured they could probably take it from us later on, and so that is where we were able to get it. Meanwhile, France and Britain later on are going to be fighting another war, and the Louisiana Purchase will come about during this conflict. As the United States was trying to purchase New Orleans, we will end up purchasing all of Louisiana, which was not just the state at that time, but the area that goes all the way to the Canadian border, double the size of the United States. Napoleon sold this land as he was afraid Britain might get it, and he was concentrating on the wars in Europe, and he figured he could always come back and get it from the United States. The Adams-Onis Treaty, as Spain had gotten weaker, Andrew Jackson, after he entered into our state of Florida, will cause some international crisis. Spain did not want to get into war with the United States. They will end up selling to Florida and other areas. Now, this is where you look at the question, how did Europe's problems benefit from the United States? As these areas are fighting each other, this is where we are benefiting, and we are able to get land from them without wars for the most part. Revolutionary War was an exception there. The Mexican Cession came about after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Mexican War. And this will be the section that will have us grow, and will reach all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. It will be all but one little last piece of the puzzle that we'll get to of the continental 48 states. This will be where the problems of the 1850s will come about. because now that we have this big chunk of land, there's going to be arguments. Should that land be free or slave? There. And that is going to be the largest issue during the 1850s or after the Mexican War. Now take a second to read this question. I will have these questions periodically throughout the notes. Some are very basic, quick review, comprehension checks of something we just covered, but some will be like this one. Now this is a smaller version of how your EOC questions will be. And they're not going to be worded the same way that I have in the notes or if you read in the book there. And this is where you have to take the ideas. And the best way to answer these is through process of elimination. Now the question said, one important result of the Mexican-American War was. Here's where, as you read the different ones, some you should automatically be able to eliminate. Hopefully the addition of Florida to the United States is something you are able to eliminate. There. And then you look and see where A is the correct answer. It goes back to where in the notes said the conflict's going to be between this new land being slave or free. All right, as we're expanding, why? Okay, why was it that from the time, even before the Revolutionary War was over, we were expanding? Part of this is, where some people say, is our American mentality, our frontier, our pioneer spirit. The idea of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, the rugged individualism that we're going to see later on in history, that term being used. But the idea that if things are going bad or you need a new start, you can always go out west. And why? Because there's always land. Now, we haven't had it yet, but you're going to see pop up a couple different times in this semester where the historian Frederick Jackson Turner will write that the United States was great because we could always expand. There was always land, cheap land, that we could get. And so this is where we will be spreading in that idea. Now, part of this is going to come later on because what happens when we do settle all that area from sea to shining sea? Where are we going to go from there? And that's when we have our imperialism unit and our Western unit in it. Now, for that time period, why did the different areas want to move out west? For the eastern and the northern areas, they wanted to have more markets for their factories. It's kind of like the old colonial idea. They needed to sell their products. They needed to have the raw materials come in. Meanwhile, for the south, a lot of it was political. They did need to expand the cotton area, but what they were more concerned with was politically, they need to keep the balance of free and slave states that was established from the 1820 Missouri Compromise. What had happened at that time was we were able to put off the issue of slavery because every time a slave state came into the United States, a free state will come in. For us in Florida, we joined the United States as a state in 1845. At the same time, Iowa will join as a free state, again keeping that balance between it. But they're going to be running out of land to go. Who wrote that the United States was great because we always had land in the West to expand and grow? And that's where it's Frederick Jackson Turner. As I said, some of the videos or some of the questions in the slides are just a quick review over something that we had. In this case, this is not a high-level question, but just a quick review of it. All right, after the war, where else can we go in there? We will purchase this little strip of land, the Gadsden Purchase. This will be the last little piece of our puzzle. There, if you see underneath the Gila River to the Mexican border that we have today, there's a strip of land. Now, a lot of times we say, where I had the question, why did we buy it? People think, well, it must have been gold or something of value at that time. It's mainly desert. They do have some natural resources, but nothing what you would think of. The main reason that we're going to buy it is for trains, because there was a plan to connect where California and the gold that is there with the east. And when building the trains, they needed somehow to get from there, and we have the Rocky Mountains. But south of here was where there was the mountain passes, and so the first train line that was going to connect the east and the west, the Transcontinental Railroad, was going to go through the south, and that's where the Southerners paid $10 million for this. We paid $15 million for the Mexican cession with Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. We buy this strip of land there. Now, that's in 1853. 1854, plans for the United States will change when the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed. But originally, that was the case. The South wants to spread in this area. The states that are today New Mexico and Arizona were areas that they thought they could expand and make those cotton plantations. Another area that the South was looking at as they were wanting to have more slave states was just to the south of us. Cuba already had slavery. Spain owned it. We tried to buy it. They would not sell it to us. We tried to have a couple of coups d'etats and overthrow it, but it would not ever happen. But that is where the South is looking to the south of Florida and hoping that they could take Cuba and make it into 3, 4, maybe even 5 slave states there. One thing also this time period, which this is not as important for us right now, later on it's going to come about, but we had this idea of trying to build what will later on be the Panama Canal. And we want to build this. And we have a treaty with Britain, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, where we are going to be negotiating with them to build a canal together there. The problem we're going to have is every time we're building it, or when France tries to build it, is the fact that there will be mosquitoes and problems in building it. And then we have one other issue. We have our Native Americans. A lot of times they are forgotten in this, but as we continue to have these conflicts, because we are moving into their land that they had for tens of thousands of years here. The United States tried to acquire what area with the Ostend Manifesto? Correct answer is Cuba. In the 1880s, what treaty did the U.S. and Britain discuss the idea of jointly building a canal in Central America? The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. This is a Jimmy Fallon clip. It's very humorous. If you are to watch it, and this is where it'll have several of those different treaties that were just in that last question, as well as talking about the Gadsden Purchase. So, little humor to add to this. All right, a term you should be familiar with is manifest destiny. This is where, from the beginning of our country, Americans had thought it was our God-given right to control area from coast to coast, from sea to shining sea. A lot of times when other countries have this idea, we think that they are radical or fanatics here. But it's okay for us, and this is where the idea, because we were exceptional there, the American race there. Now, I have the question, what is in the way of manifest destiny? Yes, this is where our problem is. We're taking the land from people that had lived there for a long time. Those of you that cannot read on the meme, it says, better not go to the bathroom, white man will steal my seat, and call it manifest destiny. Periodically, I will have different things for you to look at there. If you are watching this on a video, this will be a good time to pause it. Look deeply at this picture, and what do you see here? One thing that you should notice is how it goes from light to dark. Notice the Native Americans in the dark area. This is where it is New York City and the harbor. You see the industry. The Angel has a telegraph wire. We go from trains, we have the stagecoach. Here are some of our early farmers. We have our wagons going as they're going out west here. But this is where, for the idea of manifest destiny, a lot of times you see this. And again, the angel here. God blessing America. All right, what was the idea that the United States had the right to control the Americas? Okay, manifest destiny, what we were just discussing. Okay, the Compromise of 1850 occurred because California, after the gold rush, had a lot of people that had come and occupied it. So what was needed was for them to become a state. The United States wanted to make sure that California did not become their own country. They wanted their gold. California, there was talk to divide up to multiple states. They wanted to be one state. There was a vote to whether or not they should be free or slave, and they voted to be a free state. Most of the people that had moved to California were not slave owners. Think about it, if you were a plantation owner, you're probably not going to pick up and move when you hear about, oh, you can just pick up gold and these rivers. So this is where California had applied to become a state, a free state. There was no state in the South that was ready to become a state also, or no territory to become a state. So this is where that Austin Manifesto, there are other things where they were trying to look at other areas they didn't have, but we will end up with this big compromise that comes about. Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and some of their last days were ones that tried to get this started, but it will actually be Stephen Douglas that pushes through their ideas. Now, there are a lot of parts to the Compromise of 1850, but the main parts that you need to know. The first one was California would come in as a free state. This was monumental because after 30 years of the Missouri Compromise, keeping us together and pushing off the issue of slavery, this is where we will no longer have that. One other issue that came up was we had slave trading in the District of Columbia. Maryland was a slave state. So they outlawed the slave trading. They didn't outlaw slavery. The idea there was over time slavery would die out as you couldn't buy and sell slaves. This was seen as maybe even a possible plan for later on in the future for the South. One of the most controversial things was the Fugitive Slave Act. Now you see the word fugitive. Most of you should know that's a runaway. So a runaway slave act. This is one of the main things the South got in turn for California coming in as a free state. This law would force areas to return any runaway slaves. Now, some judges will not uphold this in the North. The South will complain about this because, again, this was something they were given. But some of the parts of the laws were not even fair to someone accused of being a runaway. Because if a judge ruled that they were a runaway, they got more money than if they were ruled to be free. But what will happen is this will have more awareness in the North there. And most of you know the Underground Railroad from your middle school times, and Harriet Tubman being the most of her people. She led over 300 people to freedom. This Fugitive Slave Act will increase more for people to go and help these runaway slaves. And that Underground Railroad many times will go all the way up into Canada to make sure that the Fugitive Slave Act would not return them back. Now, one of the major effects of the Compromise of 1850 was it will delay the Civil War. A lot of people at the time thought the South would break away, and this compromise will keep the South inside the United States. They will not secede. It will not be until a decade later that they will secede. During that 10 years, there will be massive growth of industry, railroads, population in the North. Meanwhile, the South will have massive growth of their cotton production. But the other factors that they will have and things that would help you in war, that gap is going to be increased greatly between the North and the South. Most military strategists, if they were to look at things in 1850 and say if the Confederacy was to have broken away at that time, that there was a very good likelihood that they could have succeeded in their secession there. But a decade later, the advantages that the North will have, money, industry, agricultural land that is foodstuff, all of those things had grown so much. Their population, that is where this compromise will make a long-term effect. Another thing for you to look at, and you'll notice with this map, the green area being free, the orange being slave states, and then the territories. And those other territories, most of those were where they were going to be areas that would not allow slavery. So this is where, for the South, their area to expand was decreasing a lot. All right, throughout the notes I have the things, and in class I'll show different videos. Won't always be showing all of these, but for those of you watching on a video, if you go to Mr. Betts, he has a lot of different type of things. Most of the things that he has are parodies. Some of them are really good, some are corny there. But he also has other things. He has some that has drawings. He has mean streams there that he goes and tells about it. So you should go to Mr. Bett's website to see some of these things that if you were in class, this would not be quite as long of the notes. And it'd be broken up with more of these. All right, 1854. My AP U.S. History classes, we go majorly in depth into the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But this will be one of the major years and changing time periods for the United States. In 1854, Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois, will push this through. Now, what will happen is he will do something that is good for his state. The Transcontinental Railroad that was supposed to go through the south from the Gadsden Purchase will now be pushed to go through the north. And its terminus will end up being close to this little town that you may have heard of called Chicago. He figured if the railroad ended there, we linked together the Great Lakes with the Western Railroad there, that Chicago will become a major city, which that is where our second city, as it became known later on, will emerge from. So Stephen Douglas was right about the future for his state of Illinois and Chicago. But the way that he was able to get this is the areas that were supposed to be free, the Kansas-Nebraska territories, were split up and they were able to then vote whether to be free or slave. This upset a lot of Northerners because they were always known they were going to be free because the Missouri Compromise said everything above the 3630 line was going to be free. For Southerners, it gave them a chance. The state of Missouri was a slave state, so they thought maybe the state of Kansas would be a free state. So they have a vote. Popular sovereignty means to vote. In this case, they are voting whether to be free or slave. This will end what was left of the Missouri Compromise. Before the Compromise of 1850 had ended a lot of things. Later on, we'll also have even some of the ideas with the Dred Scott case. But one of the long-term effects is the Republican Party that we have today was founded. A lot of Northern Democrats, ex-Whigs, will then join and start this new Republican Party. 2 years later, they will win a lot of electoral votes. In fact, actually be very close to winning the election if it wasn't for a small number of votes in a few key states there. But this is where the Republican Party had said, or people that joined the Republican Party were, no, we can't compromise this. We can't give this away. Again, for Stephen Douglas, this is where he is probably the most powerful man in the 1850s. He does something that's good for his state, but the consequences will be longer. A lot of historians will look and say, this will be what will cause the Civil War eventually, if you want to look at one specific time period in history. Okay, the concept of popular sovereignty in the 1850s involves citizens choosing to be slave or free. Today when you hear popular sovereignty, it means to vote. In this case, they were voting whether to be a slave state or a free state. Who successfully pushed through both the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Stephen Douglas. Mr. Betts has a video on John Brown. You may remember him from middle school. He was one that will be in Kansas when they are fighting in what is called Bleeding Kansas. He later on is going to be at Harper's Ferry trying to have a slave uprising. It'll be a little bit later in the notes, but it's a parody to a Taylor Swift song. All right, late 1850s. Here's where you probably spent a lot of time in middle school on things. The Panic of 1857 will occur, and guess what year? 1857. Now, a panic. In this case, today we would call it a recession, but at that time, usually there was something very dramatic that occurred. So, this is where this recession will occur. And what will end up happening, though, will be different in the North and the South. Throughout the North, this economic recession will have it where factories are laying off people. And most of the people that are getting laid off or fired in this case will be the poor people and a lot of the immigrants. Meanwhile, something that was ironic was in the South, they don't get nearly the effect of the Panic of 1857, and in fact, in some areas, they were able to improve economically. Now, it gave the Southerners a false sense of security because Europe was buying more cotton. So they thought their cotton made it where they were not able to suffer like economic downturns. Where I say it's a false sense of security is one reason why the European countries were buying extra cotton is they were looking and thinking the United States might go into a war. And since cotton could store over time, they were buying extra cotton for the future in case there was a war in the United States. But again, it would give the Southerners a false sense of security. The Dred Scott case, another case or Supreme Court case that you should have had in middle school. Justice Roger Taney will be the person that will have this ruling for his court. And for Dred Scott, he was a slave of an army officer. The army officer had been stationed in a slave state, goes to a free territory, brings Dred Scott with him, comes back to the slave state, goes into a free state. While he was there, people were telling Dred Scott, you're in a free state, you should be free. So he sues. Now, the case will say that a non-citizen cannot sue. Roger Taney was a strict constructionist of the Constitution. Our Constitution does have slavery in it for the original Constitution. So this is where he said, you are not a citizen, you cannot sue. But the long-term effect of this is there is no real free or slave state because the slave owner was able to bring a slave into an area that said they were free and it was still a slave. Now that would not have been a wise thing if you were a slave owner to do very often, but that is where it made it where we didn't even have that line. And for a lot of Northerners that they had looked at things and said, they didn't like slavery, but it was just something that happened down south. Well, now it is something that could be right there, even in their own backyard. So that combined with the Kansas-Nebraska Act will have it where the Republican Party is going to continue to grow. 1858, the state of Illinois was going to have a series of debates. Stephen Douglas, he is looking to 1860. He knows he's going to win the presidency. So he invites a lot of reporters throughout the nation to follow him as they go from town to town throughout Illinois to debate. Now, the person he's going against was Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was a one-term representative, but he was with the Whig Party. Now he has joined the Republican Party. Stephen Douglas is seen as one of the greatest speakers of that time period. Abraham Lincoln, most people thought he was just a bumbling country lawyer. But what happened during these debates is Abraham Lincoln proved to be able to speak the way that a lot of the common people had. And during one of the debates at the town of Freeport, he was able to get Stephen Douglas to admit what politically he had done with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Because in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Southerners had given up the right to the Southern Railroad for the chance that Kansas or Nebraska would become a slave state. But Stephen Douglas has said that, yeah, we tricked them. Not in those words, but we tricked the Southerners. And they gave away the railroad for just a chance of expanding their slave territories. But Nebraska and Kansas were not conducive to slavery. With the type of crops that would grow there, with corn and wheat being the main one. Now, long story short, Stephen Douglas is going to be the senator from Illinois there. But Northerners throughout the area got to know this Abraham Lincoln. They were reading what he was saying, and a lot of people liked him. He was a common sense guy. Didn't seem like some rich guy. He wasn't an extremist when it came to things on the issue of slavery. Meanwhile, in the South, they're also reading this, and they're reading it with what Stephen Douglas said, and they are quite upset with them. And 2 years later, in the 1860 election, these two will be two of the four candidates for president, and Southerners will remember and not vote for Stephen Douglas in large numbers, and Northerners will remember for Abraham Lincoln and vote for him. Which of the following provided the most disagreement among pro and anti-slavery forces in the 1850s? Notice this is a common theme. Abraham Lincoln disliked slavery, but he did not believe in abolition. His whole political stance in 1860 when he'd run for president was to not have slavery spread to the West. Now, this is a quick review of some of our presidents during this time period. This is not our best group of presidents. 1848, Zachary Taylor will be our last Whig that is elected president. He was a hero of the Mexican-American War. Supposedly had never even voted till he voted for himself. He was a Southerner, but he was actually not acting like a Southerner because he was a military man. So he upset a lot of the Southerners when he got into office because he did not support things that they wanted. He was more about the Union, and again, he had been for the United States Army. But during the debates for the Compromise of 1850, he will end up dying. At that time, there was a suspicion, and throughout history, we always like to have controversies and conspiracies that maybe he was poisoned. Even in the last couple decades, they dug up his body, tested the bones to see if he was poisoned, and no, it wasn't. He had eaten a batch of bad cherries or something, and it was some sort of gastronomical problem. Well, Taylor, after he died, Millard Fillmore took over and served the remainder of that term, and Millard Fillmore will be our last Whig president. Most people don't really know about Millard Fillmore. In fact, actually, I can't remember what the name of it is, but a Society for Unknowns or something like that always meets at his grave on his birthday there. 1852, we will have probably one of our saddest stories for a president that is elected. Franklin Pierce was a Democrat. He was chosen because he really didn't upset anybody. He was, after many, many votes in the convention, he was picked. He was weak. Stephen Douglas was running the show. Where I said he was sad, if you kind of look at the history of him, most everybody that was close to him will end up dying. Even on his way to his inauguration, his last living child will end up dying in an accident from the railroad there. He will, after that time where he had been more of a social alcoholic, he will become a very much a large alcoholic. And it kind of shows, even with our presidents, where their personal life has them. Again, he was really weak as a president. Stephen Douglas is getting what he wants out of him. That's when the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed. 1856, the Democrats settle on James Buchanan. Historians have gone and they have voted, and on a lot of different things, James Buchanan is listed as our worst president ever. I will have to give him a little bit of credit that I don't know if anybody could have stopped the Civil War there, and that is where a lot of times he's looked at things. But one thing that I can't give him credit for is he didn't do anything to try. After Lincoln was elected in 1860 for our guess who, that lame duck period from November till March when Lincoln was going to be inaugurated, James Buchanan didn't do anything. He didn't even try. And this is where you see from this one website where he is listed as the worst president. If you follow him on Twitter, he kind of has been writing lately that Donald Trump might be able to supplant him here. In here. Yes, there is Twitter. If you look at Twitter, where people have for old historical characters and run their Twitter account. I won't tell you who runs a Twitter account for Henry Clay. All right, one of our presidents in there before that was James K. Polk during the Mexican-American War. For you Citrus High students, okay, is that Mr. Neruda that's singing that song in there? For those of you that know, he has a little man crush on James K. Polk. All right, I have a couple little things here at the end. One thing that we'll come back to when we get to Reconstruction is the lost cause. Now, my family is old Florida family. We have been in Florida since before it was a state in here. And a lot of things happened there, and this is where I know this is a lot of writing on here, but ideology, which advocates the belief that the cause of the Confederate States during the Civil War was a just and heroic one. This is one where kind of praising their leaders, their chivalry, and what they were fighting for. It will basically go and whitewash the idea of slavery and racist in there. What happened was, and the reason why this lost cause will come about, will be first of all at Reconstruction after the Civil War and a backlash against the Northern occupation of the South. A lot of things where today we have the debate over Confederate statues. In the early 1900s, this is where most of those statues were built. They were not built right after the Civil War, because as the last veterans were dying out, they were praising them. We're also going to have the rebirth of the KKK in the 1920s, and when the KKK will be its strongest, and we'll have a whole section on that later on this year. We're going to have a group called the Daughters of the Confederacy, which they will be very powerful in making sure that in school text, not just in the North, but not just in the South, but also in the North. And this is where the idea of states' rights will be pushed there. Even in our standards for state of Florida, that is something that's included in here. And the South was fighting for states' rights here. But what right were they fighting for that they would have? And as we will later on look at the Confederate Constitution, and this is where the right of slavery will be there. For the lost cause, the reason why the South lost the Civil War was just because of the superior numbers of the North. And here, they won't write it as a rebellion. When my father went to Andrew Jackson Junior High when he was younger, he never heard of a Civil War because his books that he had called it the War of Northern Aggression. We will also have this grow in the 1950s and 60s as a reaction to the Civil Rights Movement. And later on, I'll also have a section about flags. And this is where a lot of times the Southern Cross flag, which was not what was used in the Civil War. There will be a battle flag, but it will always be square. It won't be rectangular. It will be after the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education case that the rectangular flag in this way. But the stars and bars, the Bonnie Blue flag were the true Confederate flags that you have. But this is where the lost cause, you'll see it pop up in various things in our notes. For Florida history of this time period, I'll always have a little section on that. Not going to do all of Florida history. The Spanish were the first to occupy. The English had it for 20 years. The Spanish, again, they were weak. They sell it to the United States. We become a territory. We will have the Second Seminole War, which is going to be a reaction to the Indian Removal Acts. Osceola and nearby Ocala, right on the shores of Silver Springs, will not sign the treaty, but stab his knife in the treaty that would have sent the Seminoles out west, much like how the Trail of Tears were for the Cherokee. The Seminoles never signed a treaty in any of their three wars. That's why they call themselves unconquered. They were pushed down into the Everglades there, so they did not keep the state, but they never surrendered. Florida became a state in 1845. As I mentioned before, with the Missouri Compromise, Iowa came in as a free state at the same time. Most of the population in Florida was in North Florida. What you think of today, the area to the south of us, Orlando, Tampa, St. Petersburg, and especially not West Palm, Fort Lauderdale, Broward County, Dade County with Miami, that area had very few people at all living in it. Less than 100 people were living in Miami even as late as 1880s in there. So there was a little area in what's called the Plantation Belt from Monticello to Mariana, but the biggest city was Key West, which was isolated from the rest of the state. There were not much railroads till the very end of the 1850s. Florida was definitely behind most of the South when it came to that. Here's kind of showing, if you see where it says where the settlement is, you notice that there are not people living in the south part of Florida. A little bit around Tampa Bay, you can have the Plantation Belt, the area for Jacksonville, and here this will kind of go over to Lake City in that area. Each section of our notes will have some reflection questions. Usually I will assign them, or maybe if we're doing Cornell notes, there are bases that you have. they're a good way to go over and review over the basic ideas. You'll notice later on a lot of the reflection questions are based upon the standards that we had in the very beginning.